And that's the conundrum here. There's a consensus that almost no one wants Iran to have a nuclear weapon, and there's a consensus that almost no one wants a regional war in the Middle East. So what's the way forward? We're flying in the dark to some degree right now.
We're back now with Russell, Mike, and CT's Israel correspondent Jill Nelson. Jill, thanks for being with us today.
Good to be with you.
Aid in Gaza continues to be a top-of-mind concern for those who are negotiating peace in the Israel-Gaza war. This week, activist Greta Thunberg was detained by Israel and returned home after she attempted to sail a boat into Gaza with food, medicine, and supplies. Meanwhile, early Thursday morning, Hamas killed 8 Gaza Humanitarian Foundation aid workers as they traveled to work at a food distribution site, according to the Times of Israel. Jill, we've read a lot over the last few months about starving children in Gaza. Can you help us to understand the particular plight of children and families in this region right now? I think in particular of the story you shared over at CT about a man named Osama Sawari.
Yeah, it's really a desperate situation, and I think it's difficult for us in the West to really understand what this must be like. So getting to communicate with Osama a bit, and I should explain he's a Muslim background believer. I'm not using his real name for the story because the situation for Christians in Gaza, particularly if you're a convert from Islam to Christianity, is very precarious. So the situation for him and his family is that they were basically down to a couple weeks worth of food. That was early, probably about the end of May. And he describes a situation in which they are malnourished, they're hungry, they have stomach pains quite often, and they're quite desperate to get food. So desperate that he's actually now been to some of these distribution centers more than once, despite the risk. He's been successful 2 out of 3 times. He's been able to get food for his family in pretty significant quantities. Generally, they say that these quantities last a family. If there's a box that's delivered, it lasts about 3.5 days. But yeah, he's willing to take the risk. And I think what really stuck out to me as I was talking to him, and this just probably underscores the desperation there, is that when he came home from the first attempt to get food, which, as I mentioned, was successful, it's still a pretty limited quantity of food for the desperate situation that these people are in, but he was really excited to have found some hedgehogs. And I assumed that he was excited because this might be a diversion from the war for his kids, something for them to play with. But no, this was sustenance. This was food for his family. This was a source of protein for them.
Mike, when violence erupts around these food distribution sites, those who are pro-Israel point to footage and say, oh, that wasn't the IDF. And they give other reasons for the violence. And there are so many conflicting reports coming out of this area. How do you know who to trust? And are there any truly neutral entities at play right now with the Gaza Health Ministry, who some see as an arm of Hamas, and the GHF as this Israel-U.S. partnership?
I will say it is really difficult. Short of being there and witnessing this, which we don't have journalists on the ground right now in these aid distribution sites, and probably for good reason. This is still a war zone. It's still very dangerous. And we know there's certain news outlets we can't trust, like Al Jazeera in Gaza. I think that's been proven over and over again. So it's very difficult to know how to trust or who to trust in this region. And I think what I look for is people's motives. Is there a particular reason why they would want to frame the situation a certain way? It could be that they want to protect themselves, so they're not going to say anything negative about Hamas. My source has been very vocal about Hamas's role in stealing the aid and their role really in causing grief and misery for Palestinians and really using aid and food as a weapon. And he's been very specific. He's given specific details about what he's learned about Hamas's role in stealing the aid and then selling it at exorbitant prices so they can continue to fund their war to exterminate Israel. And he's also mentioned that they have used a lot of the aid to distribute to their own people, their own fighters. the families of the fighters, and so they've been very selective in how they've distributed that aid. So for me, that gives him a measure of credibility. And in fact, sometimes in our conversations, he'll just go on and on about Hamas and their source of funding, even outside of Israel or outside of Gaza. So this is a situation where when he does say something about Israel's role and responsibility, I am more inclined to give him my ear and give him credibility in that. Now, is there a situation in which perhaps Hamas is in the wings or other militant groups, because Hamas isn't the only militant group in Gaza, shooting at people in these aid distribution sites? I think we've seen, like in Khan Yunis, that that's a very likely possibility. According to my source, Rafah has been cleared of Hamas, and this is an area in which IDF has full control. So he doesn't think that's the case. And he also has heard the unique and distinct fire of these quadcopter drones firing at this situation. And really described a situation of people being so desperate that they weren't following the IDF's instructions, and panic really just ensued. I mean, this is a population that's been without food for weeks and weeks, and the kitchens that were distributing food before have been shut down. So I can see where the situation really got out of control. And I think one of his criticisms in this process, and to be fair, he's gone back the second time he went, he said it actually went very smoothly in Rafah. But his criticism is that there's just not enough aid to go around, and people know that. And so they're showing up at times they're not supposed to show up, and they're flooding the area, and the crowd really has gotten out of control and perhaps even infringed upon some of these security zones.
I think one of the things that is that's important for listeners to keep in mind as well is that the IDF has very strict firing protocols. So in these circumstances where they're doing this more sort of like they're guarding a security corridor, or there's a curfew or this sort of thing, they've published, this is all publicly available. Like if somebody's there at the wrong time, there's a whole series of escalatory steps that the IDF is going to take before they open fire on somebody. I think one of the things that's made really especially clear, and we see this because of the events yesterday, where Hamas attacked these Gaza Humanitarian Foundation workers, is that if you want to use the language of weaponizing aid, that is what Hamas has done from the very beginning of the war. Hamas has used aid as a means of controlling the population in Gaza, and as a means of increasing the pressure on the humanitarian population of Gaza, increasing the suffering. I mean, they openly talk about this. The suffering of Gaza is a means to an end for them of making Israel look like a villain for the rest of the world, which is why the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was founded, as a way of getting around, creating an aid distribution system that got around the established networks. That by this time there's just so much evidence that has piled up that shows that those existing aid distribution networks were all compromised by Hamas.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, and I think that's important to remember that to a certain extent the blockade worked, right? Because they were stealing aid. That was a source of income for them, and it was not just food, it was medicine and other supplies coming in that they were able to then turn around. But we've seen this also with the hostages, that they've used food as a weapon, right? These hostages have come back emaciated. Michael Levy is a brother of one of the hostages who was released a few months ago, I believe in February. And he said he looked like a Holocaust survivor when he returned home. So this is a situation where Hamas is the perpetrator of the suffering of the people in Gaza. And we've seen that now for decades.
Russell, how would you respond to folks who say an 11-week blockade of food and medicine and other essentials to the Palestinian territory, that's not good either? Is it morally okay to deny people the essentials for life? Because I think in as much as we're hearing many complaints about Hamas, we're also hearing complaints about Israel's manner of response to them.
Well, yeah, I think that's a legitimate critique. I mean, I think if you're the Israeli government, you're going to be saying, what else can we do when we're trying to get around all of these Hamas obstacles? But that has to be part of the war planning, is finding a way to address this very real human suffering happening in Gaza. And what I think Hamas knows is, as Jill was saying a few minutes ago, the more the suffering accelerates, the more their power is gained over the population. I mean, that's an old. Uh, you could think of the Bolsheviks had that idea, accelerationist. Let's get the crisis as bad as it can be, so that we're the answer to it. Israel needs to recognize that and know that, and the rest of the world. And so we have had war zones before where there's been effective food distribution that has happened in much larger geographic areas. A part of the reason why we don't have it now is how dysfunctional the United Nations is, and many other aid networks, and because of how long this has gone on. When Mike mentioned the ongoing problems with aid being tied to Hamas, this was often portrayed in kind of realpolitik. We have to work with these people because they're the ones who are on the ground. I think we're seeing the horrible, horrible results of that now.
And one other thing that's related to that actually is that the other reason the aid problem didn't get solved earlier in the war is that Israel had an approach to the war that normally when a military conquers a territory, you go in, you defeat the enemy, you clear the area of the enemy, and then you hold the territory before you move to the next spot, right? For more than the first year of the war, and really until just the last few months with kind of this second effort in Gaza after the most recent peace talks fell apart, their strategy was not to clear and hold territory. And if you're not clearing and holding territory, you don't get, you're not putting yourself in a position where you can control aid distribution, you can feed the general population, you can do these sorts of things. So that has definitely affected, and it's really hindered their ability to get some of this, this aid infrastructure in place. And at the same time, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, I've spoken a number of times with Johnny Moore, who's the CEO of GHF, and what they're enormously proud of is the direct to the population aid, that the rate at which the direct aid has gotten out. I mean, yesterday alone they distributed more than 2 million meals, and it's working, and it's working to undermine Hamas, and it's working to feed these people, which, as Jill points out, the people who are really suffering from the lack of aid, the quote unquote famine that's taking place, are the people who are resistant to Hamas, are not connected to Hamas, are on the margins of a Islamist society. So this aid is really, really, really critical for the kinds of people that we want to see have a voice in what the new Gaza looks like.
One of the pain points for a lot of folks who have followed the news, it's that there used to be about 400 distribution centers across the country, and now there are only 4. Do you know of any other plans to increase the number of distribution sites so that, as you describe in Osama's story, that there will be more access, that there won't be so many lines, that more distribution of food will be able to get to the people who really need it?
Yes, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation does have plans to expand into the north. Right now, I believe most of these sites are centered in the south. I believe it's around 3 sites in the south and then 1 in the Netzarim corridor, which is, really just south of Gaza City, but it still involves some displacement for people. And so that's their goal, is that these sites will be readily available. And I'm sure over time, they'll have worked out some of the kinks in the distribution plan, and perhaps even found a system or a way to reach out to the correct number of people that each distribution site will serve.
Mike, you said recently on an episode that you had this sense that this could be the beginning of the end of the war, that it was just the beginning, as Winston Churchill said. It wasn't. There was a long tail still as we completed this war. But the news coming out now from the Middle East about the possibility of Israel attacking Iran, do you still agree with that?
Well, I think that the situation in Gaza is moving in a direction where real change can happen. You're seeing local clans coming into power in some of these regions where the IDF has taken control. They're helping with the aid distribution. They're doing some of the protection with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. They're pushing back. There's more and more outspoken resistance to Hamas from within Gaza. All of those signs point positively to an end of the war there, an end of Hamas there. What that means for the broader Israel-Palestine conflict, I'm still of the opinion that because of October the 7th, a two-state solution is not something we're going to see anytime soon. Israel's just not in a place to be able to handle that for a variety of reasons. The political unrest in Israel at the same time, I think, makes the idea of a long-term occupation and settlements in Gaza seem less and less likely in the short term, though, which I think that's a good thing. As for what's going on with Iran, I mean, we really don't know. It's a lot of speculation. You've seen non-essential personnel at a lot of embassies, in particular the Baghdad embassy, have been recalled from the region. There's some open source intelligence around, signals and chatter on United States military communication systems that indicates that something is about to happen. And we know that the talks have fallen apart. The peace talks with Iran have fallen apart. Iran is committed to getting a nuclear weapon. The United States leadership has been, up to this point, very firmly committed to the idea that Iran is not allowed to have a nuclear weapon. And, war plans for destroying their uranium refinement facilities have been on the books for a very, very long time. So is that going to happen? I mean, it's all speculation. We really don't know. Anybody who says they do know is probably lying to you. But nonetheless, it's reasonable to assume that something is about to happen there. Look, Iran's in a totalitarian regime, and it's an evil regime that is incredibly oppressive to its own people, much less its enemies. And anything that can be done to diminish their capacity to rain death around the world is a good thing. And we should be praying for anyone who gets dragged into this fight, that they have instigated and escalated with their own rhetoric and their own actions.
And that's the conundrum here. There's a consensus that almost no one wants Iran to have a nuclear weapon, and there's a consensus that almost no one wants a regional war in the Middle East. So what's the way forward? We're flying in the dark to some degree right now.
No, just to be clear, though, there is a regional war in the Middle East already. I mean, Iran's proxies are firing rockets at United States soldiers every single day. They're firing rockets into rockets from Yemen, ballistic missiles from Yemen are flying into Israel every single day. I was on a Zoom call with an Israeli source of mine just a couple of days ago, and he cut off mid-sentence. I thought the Zoom call had freezed because he kind of looks like this, and he goes, "Okay, rocket siren, I'll call you back in 10 minutes," and he has to rush to the basement. This is every single day for the average Israeli citizen. It's not a catastrophic death count because of kind of the miraculous defense technology that they have in place. But sometimes missiles get through. People do die on a regular basis from this. So there's an extent to which the regional war is happening. It's a question of how much is it going to escalate and how much is it going to involve us.
And I think it's important to remember, too, that Iran fired at Israel twice last year. And so that's really an unprecedented shift for Iran to fire directly into Israel. But we're also seeing among the Iranian population diminishing support for the regime. So there's positive trends there. And in fact, there were a number of shocking displays of support for Israel after October 7th, 2023. So we'll see what happens in Iran.
I think when we're considering how we can respond as Christians to a situation that is so big and so complex like this, it can be helpful to have specifics to pray for. As we anticipate Steve Witkoff, he's heading to Oman on Sunday for nuclear talks with Iranian officials. Russell, what could we pray for in anticipation of that kind of meeting? And what could we pray for as a result of that kind of meeting?
Well, I mean, part of the problem is it's very difficult to imagine what the solution would be that could easily disentangle all of this. And so the prayer for wisdom and discernment on every side as they come into these talks, a recognition of really what is at stake, and a way of finding a way forward. It just isn't apparent. And so part of what we have to do as we're praying right now is to recognize our limitations in terms of what we're asking for. And instead simply to ask, as Jesus taught us, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And we don't exactly know what that looks like yet.
Jill, Russell, Mike, thanks for this conversation. Listeners, as we close, we want to give a shout out to editor Lindsay, who left us a kind review in Apple Podcasts. Thanks so much for your faithful support to the Bulletin. We appreciate that you take us on your morning commute or when you run or walk the dog. We know your time is precious, and we're glad that you spend it with us. We will see you next week. Listen to the full episode wherever podcasts are found.